Welcome to the Daily Gospel of John. We're in chapter 2, taking another glimpse at this occasion where Jesus threw out the money changers and the animal salespeople out of the temple because they were dishonoring God and defiling his house of prayer. So after he throws them out, he says, get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market? His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Then the Jews demanded of him, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. The Jews replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So just kind of taking a look at this. First off, when it says the Jews in the Gospel of John, it's speaking of the religious hierarchy of the day, those who really took offense at Jesus and didn't like that he was exposing some of their corruption. And it's not talking about the average rank-and-file Jewish person of the day. And the other Gospels kind of make that clear, because in similar passage it would say the Pharisees and Sadducees challenged Jesus, and here it just says the Jews. So now it's interesting that he tells them, speaking of his body, the temple of his body, that he will raise it again. And the disciples, after he had risen, says they recalled what he said and what the scriptures had said, and they believed. Now, they didn't have copies of the New Testament Gospels at that time. The scripture that they were speaking of was the Old Testament. And so they're speaking of the prophetic glimpses of Messiah from the Old Testament. Several of them that speak of the resurrection would be Psalm 16, written 1,000 years BC, and David is the writer of that. And he says in verse 10 of chapter 16, he says, you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. So David, by inspiration of the Spirit, looked down the corridor of time, and he knew that one day he would die, but he would resurrect at that day, the resurrection day. He would resurrect and live in the presence of the Lord forever. But he also said, you will not let your Holy One see decay. Now, he wasn't referring to himself, because he did die and his body turned to dust like all of us would eventually. Now, the other prophecy is around 700 BC. And there's probably others that I'm not going to take a look at now, but in Isaiah 53, it says, it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Verse 11, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. God is going to let Jesus die. He's going to pour on him the punishment that we were due and let his soul suffer. But it says, and he will see the light of life. So it's interesting, in the same passage that's talking about this terrible sacrificial death, it says he will see the light of life. And that's speaking of the resurrection. So, Old Testament, as the old saying goes, in the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. In the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. So they both tie together, and it all ties together around Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Have a blessed day.